everyone. Welcome to another episode of Baby Names Live. If you don't know me, I am Jennifer Moss. I am the founder of BabyNames.com, and I'm also an author. I've written a series of mysteries, which currently we're up to our fourth right now, and I'm working on the fifth. And so, as you can imagine, I love baby names and I love writing. So I can combine those two loves to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which we're going to be discussing today, which is naming fictional characters. Now, I also give a workshop in writing fiction, and in the unit on characters in general, I go over character naming, which is a subject that's close to my heart. And I think some people just think they can name their characters like they name their children or like they name their dolls. And that's just not the case. There's more to it than that. And that's what we're going to go over today. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll take them as we go along and hit on the different tips on naming your fictional characters. So the first question that I ask my students when I'm giving this in my workshop is I ask, who names your characters? And that kind of stumps people. And they're like, well, I'm the author. I name my characters. But I want you to go a little deeper than that. If you want to answer on the comments right now, feel free. Who names your characters? Well, think about babies in reality, in real life. Who names babies in real life? Well, their parents name them, right? So when you're creating characters in your fictional world, you have to think like that their parents are naming them. You're not naming them. It's not your child. It's the character's parents who are naming them. So that's kind of a mind-blowing fact. And you have to frame everything as if now you are the character's parents. So some of the things that go into actual baby naming that you're going to have to think about when you're naming your characters is concentrating on the parents and family of that characters. So one thing, and this is one of my biggest pet peeves, is to make the name age appropriate. So if you have a character who's 45 and you're giving them a baby name that's popular now, then it's going to feel inconsistent and inauthentic. Now, I'm going to do a caveat because I'm giving you tips and tricks on baby naming. And yes, there will always be exceptions. But I want you to think that if you are going to do an exception to any of these tips and rules, just like in anything about writing fiction, you better be ready to explain it within the story. Okay? And I'll go over that a little later too. So make sure that when you're naming a character, if it takes place in current times and the character is 25, then maybe you want to go to the Social Security baby name site and go back 25 years to, 95? Right? Yeah, 95. And see what the top names were for boys and girls. Now, if you want to use an unusual name, that's fine too. But if you're going to use an unusual name, then that's an excellent opportunity to use it in the character's backstory. Like, why were they named an unusual name? What did it mean to the parents? How did they live with that name growing up? If it was an unusual name, it's a really great opportunity to give your characters layers and, like I said, backstory. So one is make the name age appropriate, please. And of course, if you're doing a period piece, you're going to want to research the names of that period in the geographical area where your story takes place too, because geography has a lot to do with it. As you know, even here in the United States, naming trends are different on the East Coast as they are on the West Coast, as they are in the South. So where the child was born has a dependent, the name is dependent on that as well as the ethnic background of the family. Are you going to give them an ethnic name? Now, we have the ability to choose surnames for our characters too. So we're choosing all the names for our characters. So think about that when you're choosing surnames for your characters. Where did this family come from? Were they immigrants? Were they from the early US settlers? Are they Canadian? Are they from Poland? So that's another way to give your character some depth. And then you also have to consider the personality of the parents too. Were they highly conservative? Were they wealthy? Wealthy families have different baby naming conventions. Where did they come from? But the personality of the parents, if they're very conservative, then they're not going to go and name their son Onyx like Iggy Azalea just did, most likely. The other thing is when we're talking about the parents and their personalities, you want to consider naming conventions within the family. A lot of families themselves have naming conventions. For example, let's go back to Iggy Azalea, whose actual name is Amethyst. That's a gemstone. She named her son Onyx. That's a gemstone. That's considered a family naming convention. I think it's really cool, by the way. So think about that. Some families give all the siblings names that start with the same letter, like K, like the Kardashians. Is that what's going to happen in your character's family? Think about that. Think about the family unit when you're thinking about naming conventions. And then lastly, what would the parents be influenced by? Were there family names? Was there a crazy great aunt that everybody loved that your character is being named after? If so, then again, that's a nice little tidbit to put into your story and the backstory. So names, in general, are a great opportunity for exposition, for giving your characters dimension, for giving your characters a backstory, even your minor characters. So, okay, another tip. So after all that about the parents and their lives, another tip for you as the writer, you want to avoid publicly identifiable names. So we perceive names two different ways. And you might see my cat walking around because he hangs out when I do live broadcasts, of course. He wants to be on TV. So we're going to talk about publicly identifiable names. And so we perceive names two ways. We have a personal perception. So those are all the people that we've known in our lifetime. So we might not use a baby name that was identified with the girl who picked on you in elementary school. So that's my association with the name that somebody else might not have. But there's also a public perception of names. That means that the general public would most likely associate this name with the same person. For example, Oprah. If I say the name Oprah, everyone's going to identify it with Oprah Winfrey, Madonna, Beyonce. So I would say avoid those kind of names. Or if you do choose to use them, then explain why they were chosen for your character. So if you have a character that's named Beyonce, for example, which would be really great, but you have to explain why and how your character has lived with that, her or his whole life, and if they've been laughed at, and has that affected their life in any way. So think about that if you use names that have a public association with them. Now, the other thing you want to do is you want to think about name pronunciation, because, if you're a fiction writer, a book writer, and somebody is actually, your consumer is reading your material rather than seeing it on TV or in the movies, then they have to come up with their own pronunciation in their head, right? So you have to consider your audience and say, if a name that you're using would trip them up, then that's going to take them out of the story. It's going to stop them from enjoying it, because they're going to have to stop and say, oh, there's Lionel, and say, how do I pronounce this name? So you're diverting the reader from your story, which you don't really want to do. So let's take the name Saoirse, for example, like actress Saoirse Ronan. It's Saiorse, and that's really difficult to pronounce for a lot of Americans. And I've heard her say it's pronounced Saoirse, but even in Ireland, some people pronounce it Saoirse. Some people say Saoirse, but she pronounces it Saoirse. So what do you do in that respect if you really want to use that name for your character? Well, you can introduce her by having her introduce herself to somebody else and pronouncing it for that person. So as she's pronouncing it for another character, you're really pronouncing it for the reader, so they have it in their head and they won't trip on it every time they see it throughout the story. You can also use inner dialogue to say, I hate my name, or my name is so difficult to pronounce. Nobody knows that it's pronounced Saoirse. And that can happen in inner dialogue as well. But as long as you get the pronunciation across to your readers, then that's fine. And you can use a name that might be a little difficult to pronounce. You also want to consider your genre when you're naming characters. Like, for example, in the romance genre, you can get a little flowery. Romance also has period pieces. So you might want to go back and research some names in the Edwardian period or the Victorian period that you are writing in and your world. I also want to talk about sci-fi names, science fiction, because those tend to be created names or names that are a little out there. But getting back to the pronunciation of the names, the best science fiction authors use name elements that are familiar to people and just kind of mishmash them together. So, for example, look at Darth Vader. Darth is very similar to the name Garth, only with a D on it. Anakin Skywalker. Anakin was not a name before Star Wars, but it has some very recognizable elements of words and names in our own culture here, English culture. So it's easy for us to accept it and hear it and know what it means, you know. Tyrion Lannister. Now, George R.R. Martin is an expert at character naming. Tyrion Lannister, it kind of sounds like Tyrone, but Orion. Has different name elements. Also sounds like tyrant a little, the word tyrant. But as soon as you hear it, you're like, it sounds familiar to me. And it even though it is a sci-fi name. So it all depends on, you know, making it kind of easy to pronounce inside someone's head and making sure that the elements themselves are familiar. Now, speaking of science fiction, whether you're writing sci-fi or whether you're writing a contemporary novel or fantasy, you're building your own world, right? So you're creating this world, and your world can have naming conventions within it. And I'll give you an example. George R.R. Martin is great about this, as I said. For example, wildlings in his world only have one name. People born out of wedlock, and the naming convention is they get the surname Snow. So he's thought a lot about his world and the naming conventions within his world. Even the house names are the names of the last names of all the different families that are vying for the throne. So names are super important in the Song of Ice and Fire. Is that right? Song of Ice and Fire. Yeah, right. Of Game of Thrones novels. Another example is in Handmaid's Tale. The handmaid is given the possessive surname of the man who owns her. So or actually the possessive name. So if she belongs to Fred, then she's Offred. And if she belongs to Glenn, her name is Offglen. Of Glenn. It's OF, meaning she belongs to that man. And also by stripping her of her original name, it's dehumanizing her and trying to erase the life that she used to have. So in essence, that is a great way that Margaret Atwood used in her world to explain how the new culture works by changing their names. The other thing is, if you look in Star Trek, 7 of 9 is a character name, and there's a character in Battlestar Galactica named 6. They both happen to be women, but the numbers are often meant to dehumanize a character and make them generic, because names are so associated with identity and being human that by giving them numbers, so they've used numbers as a way to give exposition to that character itself. So you have to realize that names are so embedded in our culture that we don't really realize that. But so make names a part of the culture of the world that you're building, and it will just deepen your characters and the plot and the storyline itself. Okay, so let's have some don'ts here. Another don't that you want to follow is make sure two characters don't have super similar names. This has happened to me when I was reading a couple stories, and I get confused. If there is a character named Denny and a character named Danny, then I'm like, which one is this? Is this Denny? Is this Danny? Because in my head, those names are so similar, your reader can get easily confused. Now, I know the first question I get all the time is, but what about twins? And if you want to make the point that the twins are always tied to each other and their identity is always tied to each other and they're always coming up as a unit, like the twins in The Shining or something, then I would say it's okay. But if they're main characters who have separate identities, then maybe you want to use completely different names. Real people. Let's talk about naming characters after real people. You have to be super careful about that. You cannot use character naming for retribution. I don't advise that. If you hate somebody, you cannot do that, because there is a personal aspect to it. You could say something bad about the character and the real person could take offense, and then you're liable for that. So what I say is, if you really want to use a name, let's say of your best friend, or you want to use a surname of somebody that you know, of your boss, ask them. And that's what I've done. I have a lot of characters, especially minor characters, that need first and last names, and it's hard to keep coming up with them. So I turn to my friends. And so I say, like, for example, in my last novel, I had a tactical team of FBI agents, and there were 8 of them. So I just contacted 8 of my friends and I'm like, look, I need surnames for these FBI agents. Do you want to be one of them? They're all great. They're all very capable people. There's going to be nothing bad said about them. And I get in writing that I can use their surname. And sometimes if I do that, I'll either switch genders or switch races, and definitely I use a different first name. So people who know all of us don't think that I'm making the character based on them, because that is something that you really don't want to do if you're writing fiction. Don't use a character that's based on somebody you know in real life. That's a very dangerous game, and you kind of don't want to go there. Memoirs is one thing, but we're talking about writing fiction. So if there is a name that you want to use, a first name or a last name, and you're pretty close to that person, they're a family member or they're a friend, just ask them and get their permission to get it in writing. There was an example. James Patterson used his friend's name. I think he said it was his best friend's name for one of his villains. And I believe it was Kyle Craig, which was the mastermind in his Alex Cross series. But he says, even in his acknowledgments, thank you to Kyle Craig for letting me use his name. And he's perfectly happy with it, even though he's a villain in several of my novels. So, yeah, I know. Anyway, another thing that Mr. Patterson does, which I do not agree with, is using names over and over in dialogue. For example, hi, John. How are you doing? How is your day, John? Yes, Ashley. How are you? I'm fine. Ashley, let's sit down. I really want to talk to you, Ashley. Now, that's a device that's used in television shows, specifically serial television shows, where somebody might tune in an episode and the writers want to explain who everyone is. It also happens often in pilots where they keep repeating each other's names, and it's really jarring, and people don't talk like that. So watch your dialogue and make sure they're not constantly calling each other by their names. Again, James Patterson does this all the time, specifically for his female characters, and I don't understand why, but he does that. And I know we all should be as successful as James, but that's something that really bugs me. But one thing you can do is use terms of endearment, because if you have partners and one comes home from work and they don't say, hello, Jennifer, how was your day? They say, hey, babe, how was your day? So use terms of endearment. I rarely call my daughter Miranda to her face. I'm going to use her childhood nickname, or I'm going to call her baby, even though she's 27, because she's my baby. And I go, hey, babe, or hey, baby, how's it going? How's life? So remember that people do use terms of endearment in dialogue rather than names. Miranda, speaking of which, asked, do alliterative names make more memorable characters? I think so. And if you'll notice that Stan Lee, when he names his comic book characters, he was famous for using alliterative names. And he did that because he said it was so he could remember them. Peter Parker. Things like that. And so Stan Lee was known for alliterative names. And yes, they are more memorable. You can consider that when if you want a pseudonym or a pen name too, that alliterative names are more memorable. So yes, on terms of endearment. No for relationship terms. Very rarely do people call each other sis or cuz. And that's another thing that TV writers love to do, specifically in pilots, is like, hey, sis, how's it going? Like, we don't talk like that. People don't talk like that. But there are better ways to do that. There's better ways to give an exposition on how two characters are related. For example, instead of saying, hey, sis, you can say, hey, did you talk to mom today? And just that one little turn of the phrase, you know that these two people are siblings. Because usually when you say mom and you're referring to somebody else, you're siblings. So there are better ways to do that than coming out and calling somebody by their relationship to you. Now, I get a lot of questions about the meaning of a name, and a lot of writers come to our website asking about, looking up the meaning of a certain name. And they ask me, is that important? Should I care about the meaning of a name when I'm naming a character? And I'm saying, I usually respond that it's not as important, because you're not going to know that Jennifer means white wave, or, the general public might not know the meaning of a name. So the actual literal meaning of a character name is not as important as the perception of that name. And when I say the perception of that name is the name similar to a word? And is there a connotation to that name? So, for example, in The Great Gatsby, the narrator is Nick Carraway, and Nick gets carried away by the splendor and the greatness of Gatsby. It's kind of a descriptive name. Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, Gale means a very forceful wind. That's a little more obvious. And there's Jack Torrance from The Shining. Now, Torrance is a homonym of torrent, the plural of torrent, which is a storm. So it's kind of like, Stephen King is saying there's a storm brewing here. Jack Torrance. So you can use names and words to allude to things. And that's just a little more exciting, because you might be giving your readers some subliminal messages through the names. But, are you going to know that Eloise means literally warrior? Probably not. I was watching Unsolved Mysteries the other day and saw a real life person named Pistol. So I thought, wow, that is a really cool character name if you could name a character Pistol. And I kind of wrote that down and put it away for later, because wouldn't that be cool? That definitely has connotations to that. Now, I also want to talk about diminutives. Now, we talked about nicknames, like you're going to call somebody a pet name or nickname, but you can also think of nicknames as how they reflect on the character. And, for example, if you want to call a character Jimmy, that sounds a little less responsible than, say, Jim or James. So if you have a grown-up named Jimmy, there's a perception that it's diminutive or not responsible or small or weak, even though it's not. But that's kind of the perception, because it's more of a child's name. There was a character in Dexter called Lumen, and a lumen is a measure of light. And whether you know that or not, you do kind of know that it sounds like illuminate or illumination, which comes from the same root word. And lumen happened to be kind of a light in Dexter's life at the time. So you can see that character names can be used for a lot of different things. But I recommend that instead of looking up the literal meaning, look for more of a more subtle or connotation to the name or the word. Now, another thing that we can do is use names for comedic purposes. And I do that in my books. Obviously, there's a little name plot line in every one of my books, because I like doing that and I love names. So, for example, in my second book, I had the detectives track down a suspect who is a woman named Ashley Winter. And they knocked on one door of a person named Ashley Winter to see if it was her. And a big linebacker of a man opens the door, and he says that his name was Ashley Winter. And so I was able to do like a little comedic exchange there, and they didn't believe him. And so he called his mama to the door, who had to verify that his name was Ashley Winter. And that was just a nice, light little scene in my manuscript to break up some of the heavy plots that were going on. All right, so finally, after we talk about characters, you are also naming other things within your story. And namely, that would be, no pun intended, place names and establishment names. Now, if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, you can completely make up the place names. If you're writing something that actually takes place on Earth in a actual location, then you might want to use established place names and street names, which is what I do because my novels are set in Chicago and in Evanston, Illinois. So when I talk about places and use streets and, jails like the Cook County Jail, I use the actual place names. But when it comes down to smaller establishments, such as a retail store or a restaurant, then I go and I create fictional names. And I do this for the same reason that I don't use real people's names as characters, and that you have to be really careful. Because let's say you're writing about a restaurant where everybody gets food poisoning in it. You really don't want to use an actual established restaurant name, or they could sue you. They could say it looks bad on their restaurant, and even though you're writing a piece of fiction, it looks bad on them. So you want to be careful of liability there. So I do a balance. So for place names and street names and public buildings like the Art Institute of Chicago, I use actual real names. And for smaller establishments, which something bad might happen in them, I will use fictional names. And a last example of that is in my last book. It's about the mafia, and part of it takes place in Las Vegas. I actually use one real hotel, the Stratosphere, because I wanted a scene to happen way up at the top on the outer balcony to provide some conflict there. And nothing bad happens at the Stratosphere. But then I also created a resort, a hotel and resort of my own that was owned by the mob. And I wouldn't want to pick an established resort and then say it was owned by the mob, because that would not be a good thing to do. So actually, it was a lot of fun. It was like, if I could create my own hotel, my own theme hotel and resort in Las Vegas, what would it be? And so it was a lot of fun to come up with all the details on my own theme resort. And if you want to know what it is, you're going to have to buy my books. But again, if your scenes would reflect poorly on that establishment, then make it fictional and use a fictional name. If not, if you're just holding a ball and it's a nice scene, then you can use something that actually exists. Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to know if you guys have any questions about character namings and everything that I've discussed so far. If you do, drop them in the comments. I'll be hanging around for a while. Speaking of character names, I am the co-host of the BabyNames podcast, and we're taking a little break for the month of July, but we will be back on August 4th with an episode about Twilight names and how they have affected baby naming for the last 15 years, and they have affected baby naming. And August 4th also happens to be the drop date of the new Twilight book, Midnight Sun. No plug intended, although I'm just really excited to read it. So tune in on August 4th for our next episode. My sister Mallory and I will talk about Twilight names. If you want to check out my series of mysteries with a metaphysical twist, go over to jennifermoss.com, and they're available on Amazon as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Mossifer, Mossifer. And remember, when you are naming your character names, go to babynames.com. We've got tens of thousands of names to choose from. Thanks for tuning in, and let me know what you think. You can even email me at podcast@babynames.com with questions, and I'll be sure to help answer them. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.